So if you are transporting or shipping any types of hazmat or dangerous goods, the US DOT is going to require some level of training. The training comes in various forms. There's no single approved US DOT training course or anything like that. The requirements are flexible as long as you're meeting the key criteria of things like general awareness, safety security awareness, and function-specific training. And one of the things that we notice, working with clients is it's one thing to do the training, which is oftentimes required by law, but some folks don't do a great job at retaining training records. So if you talk to a DOT inspector, if you've done training and don't have a training record, they tend to look at it as if no training has ever happened. So it's really, really important to document the training and make sure you provide training records. So when you're making up training records, what's actually required? Well, there's not that much that goes into it. At least from the DOT side, they're looking for basically the common sense things. The name of the employee that you trained, the date of the most recent training. You want to provide some type of description of the training course. You want to have the name and address of the person certifying the training, and then finally a certification statement saying that, yes, this person has been properly trained and tested. From the training record side, I think most of that is fairly common sense. That can be done through a nice printed off certification like we make here with Hazmat Safety Consulting, individual beautiful training records that you can frame and put on the wall, which of course we would recommend. But oftentimes you can handle training records through internal learning management systems, or even just down to an Excel spreadsheet with all of that information present. Now, the one question I would get on training records would be around description of the course. That is a very open-ended statement in terms of, do you need to provide the entire course, an outline, a sentence, a word? I've seen it done in various ways. From my point of view, if you want to make life easy for the inspectors, which we always do, we want them to ask fewer questions rather than more, a description of the course would include a pretty good outline in terms of how you cover general awareness, safety security awareness, and then most importantly, detailing what exact functions that you instructed the employees on. So from the DOT side, these regulations, if you want to figure out what I'm talking about, it's going to come through 49 CFR 172.704, paragraph D as in Delta, for our training records for U.S. Department of Transportation's hazmat training requirements.
So the requirements under OSHA come from 1910.1200. That is the HazCom standard, or the Hazard Communication Standard, written by OSHA. When we talk about training, it is something that is given by the employer to the employee. It also applies to temporary employees. So you can't sneak out of it by saying, oh, these were just temporary employees that were employed by somebody else. They just happened to be on our work site. No, that does not work. You'll find the specific requirements in 1910.1200H, as in Harry. That's where you find employee information and training. What OSHA requires, it requires that you train the employee to recognize the hazard in his workplace or her workplace, know how to protect themselves from that hazard, and are able to understand the labeling that should be on all of the containers to help them understand what that hazard or those hazards are. Of course, you also have to give them a little bit of training to understand how to read an SDS, a safety data sheet, and understand what those hazards are. So if we're talking about physical hazards versus health hazards, basic flammability, corrosivity, when we're talking about physical hazards. If it were health hazards, we're talking about carcinogenicity, mutagenicity, acute toxicity. So these terms are very common in the GHS world, the globally harmonized system for labeling and classification. But when you have employees who are new to this system, those words become probably GIGO, garbage in, garbage out. So it's very important that employers take the time to really have a good program for hazard communication, clearly define what those hazards are. And then the next step is make sure that you focus on the hazard that that employee is going to come in contact with. So if an employee works in a manufacturing site and they're blending or they're packaging mixtures or pure chemicals, that's great. Your employer will look at that list of chemicals and that list of hazards and train them to the appropriate level so that they can understand. They don't have to understand everything about every single hazard that's out there. OSHA requires that you train them to what they're going to be potentially exposed to. Frequency, that's always a good question. So the frequency is they must be trained before they are put in the position where they're going to handle or get near those chemicals, and that's in their work area. If those hazards don't change, technically there's no requirement to retrain them. Practically speaking, in a manufacturing site, that isn't reality. Many times you have employees moving from one area to another. In manufacturing, we want to make sure that people can flex in and flex out. And that is why most companies will train annually. That gives them some confidence that they're going to catch everybody. However, if you've got somebody who, let's for instance say their job is receiving or their job is shipping hazardous materials, and they're very well trained in DOT, you come to your crunch time and all of a sudden you pull one or two of them out and you put them in a manufacturing site. The hazards that they're potentially exposed to on the shipping dock are very different than those that they're exposed to in manufacturing. So companies have to be very careful that they ensure that when they flex them into an area, that these people are refreshed and really know what the hazards are of that area, which is why it's kind of a two-pronged attack. You have to be very general and make sure that you get people trained and that they remember the training. And that's your annual training. And then when you start flexing people in and out of areas, make sure that you're very specific about those hazards. What do OSHA inspectors look for? Well, if you may or may not know that there's an OSHA instruction, and it's CPL-0202-079. And that is the inspection guideline that inspectors are given. And if you're interested in knowing how to look at an inspection from the perspective of the inspector versus the inspected, read that. And you're going to find that what they are going to do is they're going to ask for your training records. So they're going to say, okay, I'm looking at this particular production area. Show me the training records for all the employees that are there. You might have a spreadsheet and you're going to say, yes, here is my HazCom training that I deliver annually. Here are the employees that were trained. Then they're going to go and they're going to talk to some of the employees. They will interview some employees. What they're going to ask is they may show them a particular chemical, sodium hydroxide. They're going to look at that label and they're going to ask the employee, do you understand what those hazards are? Can you tell me what the broken test tube means? What does that mean to you? Hopefully, you've done your training well. They've actually listened and paid attention to the training, and they're going to be able to tell the inspector, yes, that means that sodium hydroxide is a corrosive material. Then they might ask them, well, how would you protect yourself from that chemical? Fortunately, in the precautionary statements and the hazard statements that are on the label, even if they can't remember, there's hints there. So they may be physically looking at that label and it's going to say, don't eat or drink before using this chemical. Wash hands after using this chemical. So there's some nice hints there. But they're probably also going to say that if I have to come in contact with that, I'm going to wear my gloves. Right? So we want to make sure that people understand what engineering controls are, and those are found in Section 8 of the SDS, and that they also understand the very practical reality, which is, if I get exposed, what do I do? How do I protect myself from being exposed? And that's where the PPE comes in. What happens if I get exposed? You go to the Eyewash, you go to the shower, you stay under there for 15 minutes, you continue to wash your eyes, wash your skin, those types of things. So this is all part of the HazCom program, which includes all the physical training for your employees. That was probably a very long explanation to a very simple question, but as you're probably aware, it's not as simple, especially when you're working with a large number of employees who sometimes English is not their first language. which brings up another point. You have to make sure that your training is actually understood. So if you have a predominantly Hispanic set of employees, maybe on one shift, and they all speak Spanish, you need to work very carefully with someone who is good at both Spanish and English, bilingual, who can make sure that they understand how to translate those hazards into what they understand. In essence, you can't just have a document, just like with hazmat training. You can't just have this document, throw it in front of them and say, read it and enjoy, do the right thing. That's not sufficient. They have to understand the message that you've given them and be able to communicate back to an inspector what the hazards are, how to protect themselves, what the risks are.
Barbara mentioned for the OSHA world, it sounds like the frequency is a little bit more, I guess the word open-ended may be okay. I would just contrast that a little bit with the Department of Transportation. So if we're looking at the hazmat regulations, it is not open-ended in terms of how long you need to go before you have recurrent training is kind of the word that we use. So from the DOT regulations, they're going to tell you that initial training is going to be required within 90 days of starting up a new job or a new function. And then at least every 3 years, you need to go through and complete a recurrent training course in order to be, to remain certified as a hazmat shipper, if you want to use that terminology. So we get a lot of questions around that 3-year rule. So USDOT, like I said, 3-year is the answer, but there are other regulations out there which differ. The question comes up all the time. If I'm air shipping hazardous materials, most people are going to be using either the ICAO technical instructions or the IATA dangerous goods regulations, which apply for air transport of hazardous materials or dangerous goods. And if you open up those regulations, you're going to see that training is required every 2 years. So how do you square that circle? Well, here in the United States, the regulations of the Pipeline Hazmat Safety Administration apply federally. So the 3-year rule is the 3-year rule if you're based in the United States. A DOT inspector cannot enforce against an ICAO or an IATA training schedule, right? So 3 years is the minimum. With that said, depends on what you're shipping, but a lot of the time, 3 years is a long time to go between trainings. I'll be honest, there are some chemicals and products that the regulations have been stable on those for decades. And so, the way I might ship an aerosol today is, pretty similar to how I shipped it in 1996. That is not true for certain other products, lithium batteries being an obvious example. So if you're shipping lithium batteries and you took a training today in June of 2026, I guarantee you the regulations are going to look a lot different by June of 2029. So when we're advising on training, especially in the more dynamic fields where you have products like batteries, we try to say, hey, every year would be great. Minimum, I would do it every other year at least, because the rate of change with these battery regulations, it's really feels like, yearly you get some pretty significant regulatory changes in ways that you don't for other types of products. Sorry.
You might bring up a really good point though, because it's not only that you want to refresh the training for your employees, but the requirements have changed, so you need to update your training. And if you're not paying attention to that training and paying attention to the changes in the market and the regulatory framework, you're going to miss something. And then when the inspector comes in and says, well, clearly this changed last year and you failed to blah, 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 you have no leg to stand on.
I've definitely seen that. Somebody says, yeah, we have training. We've done our lithium battery training. Here's the course. It's from 2020, 2021. And they say, we just use this every year to retrain our employees. And if the information was accurate, that's great. But the regulatory changes in the last 5 years have been significant to the point that just using an air shipment as an example, years ago, you could ship a few standalone batteries under certain exceptions, which would eliminate the need for hazard class labeling, eliminate the need for shipping paperwork, certainly have no state of charge requirement. If you want to make that same shipment today, that's going to get caught, it's going to get put off to the side by your carrier. A DOT inspector is likely to be notified of something like that, and you might have a knock on the door and some questions to answer. So Barbara's got a great point. It's one thing to have a training, but you really, really need to have it updated so it reflects current standards.